She thought she would marry a handicapped millionaire, but what happened at the wedding left her. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The grand wedding hall shimmered under golden chandeliers. Hundreds of guests whispered behind glittering champagne glasses, their voices carrying a mix of curiosity and ridicule. At the center of it all stood a young woman in a pristine white gown, her veil trembling with the rhythm of her breath. Her hands clenched around the bouquet as though it were the only anchor stopping her from collapsing. Everyone's eyes shifted when the heavy doors creaked open. A man in a sleek wheelchair entered, his suit perfectly tailored, his presence commanding despite his silence. The crowd fell quiet. The murmurs began again, sharper this time. Poor girl, she is marrying him for the money. Do you think she can endure a life like that? She must be desperate. No one marries a crippled man unless it is for fortune. The bride's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin higher. Every word cut into her heart, but she refused to let them see her break. The man in the wheelchair moved closer, his face calm, unreadable. When he reached her side, the bouquet slipped slightly from her grip. In an instant, he leaned forward and picked up a fallen petal with precise fingers. For a moment, their eyes locked. She caught a flash of something unusual in his gaze, confidence, even defiance, as though the weakness everyone assumed did not belong to him at all. A ripple of unease surged through her. Why did his eyes not match the story she had been told? Why did he look at her, not as a broken man, but as someone holding back a secret? The officiant's voice rose, beginning the vows, but her thoughts drowned out the words. She remembered how she had been forced into this situation, how only weeks ago her father's debts had closed in like a storm. She remembered the contract she had signed, the ink staining her trembling hand. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. He had promised distance, a cold arrangement, an exchange of names and nothing of hearts. And yet, standing here beneath the gaze of hundreds, she felt her chest tighten with something she could not name. This was not the wedding of her dreams. This was a stage set for judgment, for whispers, for humiliation. As the man shifted in his chair, his hand brushing against hers, the air around them changed. For just a second, she felt a quiet strength radiating from him, a presence that did not belong to a broken man, but to someone hiding behind carefully crafted walls. The guests watched, waiting for the vows to seal their fates. The bride's lips trembled. The groom's eyes glimmered with something he would not yet reveal. And as the ceremony pressed forward, she wondered if the man she was marrying was truly who he appeared to be. The sound of the vows still echoed in her mind, but her thoughts drifted back to the moment when everything had begun. It had not started with love, nor even with choice. It had begun with desperation. Just 3 months earlier, her family's world had crumbled. Her father's small business, a modest construction company, had collapsed under debts he could no longer repay. Bank notices piled up on the kitchen table. Creditors came knocking at the door, their voices loud, their threats louder. Her mother's health was already fragile, and the stress only worsened it. Her younger brother looked at her with eyes filled with fear, as if silently begging her to find a way out. She had searched for jobs, any jobs, to pay even a fraction of what was owed. But the amount was overwhelming. It would take years, maybe decades, to repay. The pressure closed in like walls with no doors. Then, one evening, a black car had stopped in front of their worn-down house. A sharply dressed attorney stepped out, holding a briefcase and a calm smile that did not reach his eyes. He had delivered an offer, almost like a riddle. "There is a man," he had said, sliding a document across the dining table. "A very wealthy man. He requires a wife, but not in the way you imagine. This would be a contractual marriage. In exchange for your cooperation, your family's debts will disappear. Every cent, gone." Her father's hands had trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. Her mother's lips quivered with both relief and shame. She had stared at the document, her heart pounding so loudly that she thought it might shake the walls. "Why me?" she had whispered. The attorney had not hesitated. "Because he has chosen you. and because you are in no position to refuse. The contract was clear, cold, and cruel. It demanded loyalty in name only. There would be no expectations of intimacy. They would present themselves as husband and wife in public, but behind closed doors, they would live separate lives. The duration of the contract was 1 year. After that, she would be free to leave, her family's burdens erased. Her hands had shaken as she held the pen. Every instinct screamed to run, but then she thought of her brother's pleading eyes and her mother's failing health. She had signed. The first time she met him had been in a dimly lit room, a private chamber at his estate. He had sat in a wheelchair, his sharp features framed by shadows. His suit was flawless, his expression unreadable. "I do not want a wife," he had said flatly, his voice deep and calm. "I want an arrangement. If you follow the rules, you will never lack comfort. But if you break them, I will end this contract immediately." She had nodded, unable to speak. Her throat felt dry, as though words themselves had abandoned her. "Rule number 1, he continued, you will not pry into my affairs. Rule number 2, you will not attempt to leave before the contract ends. Rule number 3, in public, you will act the part of a devoted wife. Can you do this?" She had forced herself to say yes, though every syllable had felt like swallowing broken glass. From that day, her life changed. The modest home of her childhood was replaced by marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and servants who bowed as she passed. Yet comfort felt like chains. The wealth surrounding her only reminded her of the contract that bound her to a stranger who kept his distance. He rarely spoke to her outside of necessary exchanges. When he did, his tone was measured, his gaze unreadable. But in the silence, she sometimes caught him watching her, not with affection, but with an intensity she could not explain. At night, lying awake in a vast bedroom too large for one person, she would replay their first meeting in her mind. The way he had declared the rules with such certainty, the way his eyes had lingered on her for just a moment too long, the way he carried himself, even in a wheelchair, with a strength that seemed to contradict weakness. And now, standing beside him at the wedding ceremony, she could not help but wonder, was this really just a contract? Or had she walked into something much deeper, something she had not been warned about? Life after the wedding settled into a strange rhythm, one that felt more like a performance than a marriage. By day, they appeared together in front of others, the perfect picture of a newlywed couple. By night, they retreated to opposite corners of a mansion that was as beautiful as it was suffocating. She tried to adapt. She explored the vast hallways, the gardens filled with roses that looked as though they had been painted rather than grown. She lingered in the library, where the scent of leather and old paper gave her a kind of comfort she had not expected. Yet everywhere she turned, she felt the presence of unspoken rules, invisible walls built between her and the man who was now her husband in name. He kept his distance, always polite, always controlled. When staff or guests were around, he would gently guide her hand, speak to her, in a tone warm enough to convince outsiders. But the moment the doors closed and they were alone, his warmth vanished, leaving only silence. It was in those silences that the friction grew. She could not tolerate the emptiness. One evening, she found him in the grand study, his wheelchair angled toward the fireplace. Papers were spread across his desk, figures and contracts she did not understand. She stepped forward cautiously. "Do you ever stop working?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. His eyes lifted to hers, steady and unreadable. "Work is what built everything you see around you. Without it, none of this would exist." Her heart tightened. "None of this feels like living. It feels like a cage." For the first time, his gaze flickered with something sharp. "You signed the contract. You knew what this was." Her breath caught. Anger rose in her chest, but she bit it back. She wanted to scream that she had signed because she had no choice, that she was carrying the weight of her entire family on her shoulders. But the words stayed trapped in her throat. That night, she sat at her vanity table, sketchbook open in front of her. Drawing had always been her refuge, the one place where her thoughts could spill freely. She sketched the curve of the garden arch, the shadows of the grand staircase, even the outline of his wheelchair near the fireplace. Her pencil moved quickly, almost frantically, until her hand ached. Unbeknownst to her, He sometimes lingered in the hallway, watching from the shadows. He saw the way she poured her unspoken emotions into each line, how her face softened when she drew. His expression remained hard, but his eyes betrayed something else, something he kept buried. The following morning, they clashed again. She had ventured into the kitchen, eager to try baking something simple for herself. The head chef rushed in, horrified, insisting she should not trouble herself. Moments later, her husband appeared, his presence filling the room. "You do not need to do this," he said firmly. "There are people hired to take care of everything you could possibly want." She straightened, flour dusting her fingertips. "Maybe I do not want everything handed to me. Maybe I just want to feel normal again." His jaw tightened. "Normal is not part of this life. You chose this." Her voice rose, trembling but determined. "I did not choose you. I chose to save my family." The words hung heavy in the kitchen. The staff froze, pretending not to hear. He stared at her, his face carved from stone. But for the briefest moment, his eyes flickered with something pained, as though her honesty had struck deeper than he expected. Later that night, she sat once more with her sketchbook, her tears blurring the lines on the page. She drew a locked gate, the bars twisting upward into the sky. Beside it, almost without realizing, she drew a figure in a wheelchair, shadowed, watching from a distance. And down the hall, in his private chamber, he held a single sheet of paper he had quietly taken from her discarded sketches. His fingers brushed the drawing as though it were fragile glass. For the first time, his carefully built mask wavered. The clashes continued, small sparks that lit fires in the quiet of the mansion. Yet beneath every harsh word and every silence, something unseen began to grow, something neither of them was ready to admit. The days grew colder as autumn settled over the estate. The trees lining the driveway shed their leaves in swirls of gold and rust. Inside the mansion, silence thickened like fog, broken only by the sound of her footsteps echoing through the halls. She tried to fill the emptiness with her sketchbook, but even the comfort of drawing could not stop the loneliness that pressed on her chest. One evening, determined to clear her mind, she worked late into the night in her small corner of the library. She had lost track of time, her pencil moving furiously across the page. The candle burned low, casting shadows that stretched along the walls. When she finally stood, her vision swam. The room tilted. A wave of dizziness swept over her, and before she could steady herself, her knees gave way. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her sketchbook slipping from her hands and hitting the floor. When she opened her eyes again, the light was softer, gentler. She was in her own bedroom, tucked under the blankets. The faint aroma of ginger and rice lingered in the air. On the nightstand beside her bed was a bowl of steaming porridge, still warm, and a glass of water. She blinked, confused. How had she gotten here? Then the door opened quietly, and he stepped inside. He moved with calm precision, carrying another folded blanket. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw no coldness there, only concern quickly hidden behind composure. "You should not push yourself until you collapse," he said, his voice low but firm. "Your body will not forgive you if you do." Her lips parted in surprise. "Did you bring me here?" He placed the blanket over the chair by her bedside. There was no one else awake. "I did what needed to be done." Her gaze dropped to his legs, hidden beneath the tailored fabric of his suit. Something unsettled her. How had he lifted her? How had he carried her up the wide staircase? She shook her head, dismissing the thought as impossible, but the seed of doubt lodged firmly in her mind. He cleared his throat and gestured toward the porridge. "Eat. It will help." She picked up the spoon with trembling hands. The porridge was simple, but the warmth spread through her chest. For a brief moment, she felt seen, not as a burden or a contract, but as a human being. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would you bother?" His expression darkened slightly, as if he regretted being caught in this moment of gentleness, because no one should be left to suffer alone. The silence stretched between them, heavy but no longer hostile. She studied his face, the sharp lines softened by the dim light. For the first time since their marriage began, she wondered what kind of man truly sat before her. The next morning, she awoke to find her sketchbook neatly placed on the bedside table, the pages carefully aligned, as though someone had handled them with care. She ran her fingers over the cover, her heart racing. Had he looked inside? Had he seen the drawings that revealed more of her than words ever could? At breakfast, He did not mention it. He spoke only of schedules, appearances, and routine. Yet when she glanced up, she caught him watching her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. The wall between them had not fallen, but it had cracked, and through that small fracture, something unfamiliar began to slip in. That evening, as she sat once again sketching by the window, she found her lines softer, her strokes gentler. She was no longer just recording the shapes of rooms and gardens. Almost without meaning to, she sketched the curve of his face, the angle of his hands, the shadow of his presence. Down the hall, in his private study, he stared at a single page he had taken from her sketchbook the night before. It was a drawing of her own reflection in the library window. Fragile, yet resilient. His fingers brushed the pencil lines, and for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder what it would feel like to break the rules of his own making. Winter descended quickly, blanketing the city in frost. The mansion glowed with lights as preparations were made for a grand family gathering. It was to be the first time she would face his relatives since the wedding, a crowd of wealthy men and women whose eyes judged more sharply than their words. She dressed carefully that evening, her gown elegant but modest, her hair pinned with trembling hands. When she descended the marble staircase, he was waiting at the bottom, his wheelchair angled toward her. His gaze swept over her, unreadable, but she noticed the way his eyes lingered for a heartbeat longer than usual. "You will be fine," he said simply, offering his arm. She placed her hand lightly upon it, though her heart raced with unease. The banquet hall was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the rich aroma of roasted meats and fine wine. Yet beneath the surface shimmered whispers. Heads turned as they entered, voices dropping to hushed tones. There she is, the girl who married him for his money. Such a pitiful arrangement. She will endure until she secures her fortune. I wonder how long she can pretend. Each word was like a blade pressed against her skin. She forced a smile, her grip tightening on the stem of her glass. Her husband sat beside her, expression calm, as though untouched by the poison in the air. Dinner began. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as servants moved silently between tables. She tried to eat, but every bite tasted of humiliation. One of his cousins leaned across the table, his lips curling into a smirk. "So tell us," the cousin said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "What is it like, marrying a man who cannot even stand on his own 2 feet? Do you pity him every day, or have you learned to enjoy the privileges?" The table erupted in cruel laughter. Her cheeks burned crimson, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on her plate. Her husband's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. Another relative chimed in, her tone dripping with disdain. "She is young, pretty. It is obvious why she agreed. Debt, desperation, and a very convenient contract. What a clever bargain." The laughter grew louder, echoing through the hall. Her chest ached, her hands trembling around her fork. She wanted to defend herself, to scream that she was more than a pawn, but her voice caught in her throat. Then, suddenly, the laughter stopped. Her husband's voice cut through the room, sharp and commanding. "Enough." Every head turned. His expression was no longer calm. His eyes blazed with a cold fury that silenced even the boldest relative. "This woman is my wife," he said firmly, his words carrying weight that demanded respect. "She does not owe you explanations. She does not need your approval. And if anyone here believes they have the right to insult her under my roof, they are free to leave and never return." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. No one dared to speak. The cousin who had mocked them earlier looked down at his plate, his smirk wiped away. She stared at her husband in shock, her heart pounding. It was the first time he had ever defended her so openly, the first time he had raised his voice not in anger toward her, but in protection. The rest of the evening passed in strained quiet. Conversations resumed, but the laughter never returned with the same cruelty. When the dinner ended, he wheeled himself beside her, guiding her gently through the departing guests. Back in the quiet of the mansion, she turned to him, her eyes shining with confusion. "Why did you do that?" she asked softly. He met her gaze, his voice calm once more. "Because respect is not negotiable. Not for me, and not for you." Her chest tightened, a strange warmth spreading where moments before there had only been shame. For the first time, she wondered if the contract that bound them was beginning to weaken, replaced by something far more dangerous, something that could not be written in ink. The house was quiet after the storm of the family gathering. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the words he had spoken replaying in her mind. He had defended her. For the first time since their marriage began, she had not felt like a pawn, but like a woman worth protecting. The next morning, she found herself studying him differently. At breakfast, when he lifted his coffee cup, she noticed the steady control in his movements. When he looked at her across the table, his gaze lingered, softer than before. The cold distance that had once defined him seemed to falter, revealing glimpses of something warmer beneath the surface. Their days began to shift. They still kept their distance in public, playing the roles that society demanded, but in private, small cracks appeared in the walls between them. One afternoon, she wandered into the kitchen again, determined to bake bread on her own. When he discovered her there, instead of scolding, he surprised her by rolling closer and quietly watching. "You are determined," he said, his voice carrying a trace of amusement. She smiled faintly, her hands covered in flour. "It is something I can control. It makes me feel human again." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then he reached forward and adjusted the bowl slightly, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, but it sent a tremor through her chest. She looked up, and their eyes met. Neither of them spoke, but something unspoken passed between them. That evening, she sat with her sketchbook near the window. The garden outside was drenched in moonlight, the roses silver in the glow. He entered quietly, carrying a glass of wine, and paused when he saw her drawing. "What do you see when you sketch?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered honestly. "I see what is hidden. Things people do not say, feelings they try to bury." His gaze darkened, but he did not look away. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on the edge of her sketchbook. "And what do you see in me?" Her heart raced. She lowered her eyes to the page, where the faint outline of his face was already taking shape. "I see someone who hides more than he shows. Someone who carries secrets." For a moment, his mask slipped. His lips parted, as if he might confess something. But then he shook his head and stepped back. "Careful. Some truths are not meant to be drawn." The words hung heavy in the air. Yet even in his retreat, she felt the bond between them deepen, a thread pulling them closer despite the rules he had set. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the mansion softened. They began to share small moments that felt strangely normal. Together they strolled through the winter garden, their breath visible in the cold air. They spoke of trivial things, weather, books, even the taste of bread she had managed to bake without burning. Each conversation chipped away at the barriers that once seemed unbreakable. One night, as snow fell outside, they sat near the fireplace. She sketched while he read silently. After a long pause, he glanced at her drawing and asked, "Do you see a future in your sketches, or only the present?" She looked at him, startled by the vulnerability in his voice. "I see possibilities," she said softly. "But they change, depending on the choices we make." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her face. "Then draw carefully. Some choices cannot be undone." Her pencil trembled in her hand. For the first time, she sensed that the contract binding them was no longer the only thing keeping them together. Something else was taking root, fragile, yet undeniable. As the fire crackled and shadows danced across the walls, she realized with a sudden clarity that the man she had once feared and resented was no longer a stranger. He was becoming something more, something she could not yet name, but something her heart was already beginning to understand. The day of their formal wedding celebration arrived at last, a grand ceremony arranged not by choice but by obligation. His family demanded a public spectacle, and society expected nothing less from a millionaire. The church was filled with music, flowers, and a sea of curious faces, all eager to witness the union that had been whispered about since the contract was signed. She walked slowly down the aisle, her gown trailing behind her like a river of white silk. Every step felt heavy, every gaze upon her heavier still. Whispers followed her like shadows. The poor girl married him for his money. She will endure, collect her reward, and disappear. The same cruel refrain, echoing louder in the sacred hall. At the altar, he waited in his wheelchair, immovable and calm, His eyes, however, burned with an intensity she could not decipher. When their hands met, her skin prickled, her chest tightening with a mixture of dread and unspoken hope. The officiant's voice rose, solemn and commanding. "Do you take this man, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Her lips trembled, but she forced the words out. "I do." Then the question was turned to him. He held her gaze, his voice deep and unwavering. "I do." Applause rippled through the hall, but before it could swell into celebration, he did something that froze the room. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself up from the wheelchair. His hands gripped the armrests, and with steady strength, he rose to his full height. Gasps echoed like thunder. The music faltered, voices rose in shock. She staggered back, her eyes wide in disbelief. You can walk?" she whispered, her voice breaking. He took a step forward, each movement firm, undeniable. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "I am not the crippled man you believed I was." The hall erupted in chaos. Guests stood, whispering, shouting, pointing. Cameras flashed, as if capturing history itself. Her world spun. The contract, the humiliation, the pity, all of it flashed through her mind. Rage and betrayal surged like fire in her chest. "You lied to me," she cried, her voice shaking. "All this time, you let me believe. Let the world believe that you were broken." He did not flinch. His gaze stayed locked on hers, unyielding. "I hid the truth because I needed to know. Would you still stay if I had nothing to offer but a broken shell? Or would you leave like everyone else?" Her hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet. The hall full of people vanished in her mind. Only he remained before her, a man who had deceived her yet stood vulnerable in his revelation. And in that moment, she realized nothing would ever be the same again. The church remained in uproar, but she no longer heard the voices. All she saw was him, standing tall where moments ago the world believed he was bound to a chair. Her chest heaved, her vision blurred with tears that stung like fire. "You played with me," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. "You made me carry your lie in front of everyone, while I endured their pity, their cruelty. Do you know how many nights I wanted to disappear just to escape the shame?" He stepped closer, his expression firm but no longer cold. "I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to see if you were different. Every person around me sees money, power, status. No one sees me. But you endured humiliation for your family's sake. You stayed even when you could have cursed my name and walked away." Her hand shook as she wiped at her tears, her voice trembling. "So I was your experiment? A test of loyalty? A toy for your pride?" His jaw clenched, but his eyes softened, raw and unguarded. "No. At first, yes, it was a test. But then I saw your strength, your kindness, your dignity. You are not like the others. You made me feel something I thought I had lost a long time ago." Her bouquet slipped from her grasp, petals scattering across the polished floor. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" she asked bitterly. "You crushed my trust. How can I believe a single word from you now?" The silence between them was louder than the crowd. He took another step, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Then do not believe my words, believe my actions. From this moment, I will prove myself to you, not as a millionaire, not as a man playing crippled, but as the one who cannot imagine life without you." Her tears fell freely now. Rage and pain warred with the faint spark of hope in her chest. He reached for her hand, but she pulled back, her heart too torn to surrender. The officiant tried to restore order, the guests buzzed with scandal, but the two of them stood locked in a battle of truth and emotion. And as she looked into his eyes, she realized that the real decision was no longer about the contract, the wealth, or the deception. It was about whether her heart could forgive. The chaos of the church swirled around them, but he raised his hand and silence fell, as though the weight of his voice commanded the entire room. His eyes did not leave hers. "I deceived you, and I cannot erase that," he said clearly, every word echoing off the marble walls. "But I will make it right. Your family's debts are already gone. You are free to walk away, if that is what you choose. But I do not want this marriage to be a contract anymore. I want it to be real." Her chest tightened, Freedom, the very thing she had prayed for, was suddenly within reach. And yet, as she looked at him, she saw not the man who had lied, but the man who had defended her, the man who had carried her when she fell, the man whose eyes betrayed feelings he could no longer hide. Slowly, he pulled something from his jacket, her sketchbook. He opened it to a page she had not known he had kept. It was a drawing of them together beneath the rose garden arch, her hand in his, their faces turned toward a horizon yet unseen. "This is what I want," he said, his voice breaking. "Not the mask, not the lie, just us. If you can forgive me, I will spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve you." Her tears blurred the sketch, but her lips curved into a trembling smile. She stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then prove it." By never letting go again. The church erupted not with whispers of scandal, but with applause that rose like thunder. The contract had ended, but a new vow had begun, one written not on paper but in the beating of two hearts. And for the first time, she no longer felt trapped, she felt chosen.